My name is Bill Kerrigan. I'm the chair of the History Department, and I'm excited to be the moderator of this panel. I am going to begin with just a few words about the Black Panther before turning it over to our esteemed guest. I will introduce each of them in just a minute. But before that, just a couple of points of context, which maybe will be repeated. But of course, I think we're all here because of the film, which was so phenomenal last year. In 2018, of course, it was the highest grossing film in the United States in 2018. For those of us who've seen the film and know the cast of characters and the setting, I think it was remarkable. For someone who grew up in rural Texas and still goes back to rural Texas, I find this one of the episodes of it's hard to believe some things happen. The world that we live in produces things all the time in our president, in our popular culture, which don't seem to always fit. This is one of those moments. In any event, quite a remarkable episode. It's the ninth grossing film of all time in the history of the world. It's the third highest grossing film in the history of the United States. And of course, in addition to that, it's not Transformers Revenge of the Fallen. It also has received acclaim from critics all over. Of course, it was nominated, I believe, for 7 Oscars, won 3, many other awards throughout the way. So we're here because of the power and the success of the film. I do, of course, as an old guy, want to make a note of the comic, which some of you know that I had. This is the first appearance of the Black Panther from 1966, July of 1966. What's interesting, this predates the establishment of the Black Panther Party, which is October of 1966. And Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, who created the character, have consistently said that that was a coincidence that they were named together. But it is not a coincidence that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby wanted to create a powerful and appealing and sympathetic African-American lead character. And I want to take you back a little bit to 1966 when this comic came out and to kind of explain a little bit about what it meant at the time, because there's no doubt about the film's importance, but I think sometimes we might not understand the historical context. So I do, of course, love my first appearance, but actually I'm equally proud or more proud of the issue three issues later, which did not have the Black Panther in it, but which did have the letter column. And for those of you probably don't even email today, but in the old days you wrote an actual letter to the writers or the editors talking about it, and then there would be response. And I find this exchange probably my single favorite exchange in all of comics letter columns. The author of the letter I'm going to read to you is an African American from Detroit, Michigan. And here I'll just read to you what he wrote to Stan and Jack. And he's first referring in the first part of it to the fact that Stan Lee and Kirby had already created an African-American character in 1963, Gabe Jones, who was in Sergeant Fury's Howling Commandos. Now, he was not a superhero, but he was a prominent character in Sergeant Fury's group. Anyway, here's what he says. I was joyous about your breaking all the precedents of your profession and introducing a Negro as a hero in the form of Sergeant Fury's Gabe Jones and as the man on the street. This subject before the advent of Marvel seemed to be an unwritten taboo, but now a real-life Negro superhero. They almost had me doing flip-flops, and I was walking around in a daze saying, "This is good, this is good." His introduction, origin, and first fight against a real-life supervillain were all superb. Henry Clay III of Detroit, Michigan. Now that's, I think, impressive, but here's what Stan Lee wrote in case anyone was wondering about his intentions with the character. First of all, he says he's very happy to get the letter and all of this kind of stuff, and he says, let's base our opinions of a fellow human being on his basic qualities and character, not on the color of his skin, the name of his God, or the place of his birth. Perhaps a comic mag isn't the proper place for this type of discussion, and yet there's just a chance that these pages, which are so widely perused by thinking readers throughout the world, are possibly one of the best places of all. I just want to emphasize that I think this is absolutely true. Mississippi and Alabama worked extremely hard to prevent integration and the breaking down of Jim Crow. But one of the things that slipped through their web of complete opposition was weekly deliveries of Marvel comic books in the corners of Birmingham and Atlanta and where I grew up. And I think they did make quite a difference. Anyway, I'll end it there and I'll turn it over to our panelists. I'm going to introduce all of them briefly and then they'll go in the order in which I've introduced them. The first of our guests is Delise Williams, who's Assistant Professor of English at Delaware, the University of Delaware. She's already published a critical article on the film. She teaches writing and on global Anglophone literature. Our second panelist will be Walter David Grayson, and complete and open regards here. Walt and I are longtime friends. He is the chair of Educational Counseling and Leadership at Monmouth. He's the author of a fantastic book, which I've assigned to my students this semester, called Suburban Erasure, about the end of the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey. He's also part of the Wakanda Syllabus, a founding member of the Wakanda Syllabus Project, and he might not want me to mention this, but he has produced his own comics which touch on many of these important issues. Next, we have Katrinka Samdal-Sands, who is here at Rowan, Associate Professor in Political Science Department, a political geographer, who is at work currently on a research project on politics and space in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And then we are very excited to have two student panelists who will join us as well. We have right here Nidrima McDuffie, who's an International Studies and Africana Studies double major, and also I've just learned has been chosen to represent my college, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, as our commencement speaker in May. Congratulations, Nidrima. We also have Pulumi Adansina, who is a political science major, and we are super excited to have her speak as well. All right, that's it for me. On to Dr. Williams.
Hi there. I am really excited to be here because even though I study mainly literature from India and Pakistan and other places like that, so occasionally I make a foray into the cinematic universe, and here I am being invited to talk about it. I'm excited to be here. So thank you for the invitation. So I loved Black Panther for many of the same reasons that millions of other moviegoers had fallen in love with the film. The seductive depiction of an Africa unburdened by colonialism and slavery, the celebrations of Black family and Black love, and the portraits of smart, passionate, powerful women. Because I loved it so much, I wanted to savor my enjoyment of it for as long as I could, so I took a long time before I read anything that was critical of the film. I found, eventually though, I realized I had to confront it. I had to see what other people were thinking. I was really curious about what other people were thinking. So I found Christopher Lebron's article, Black Panther is Not the Movie We Deserve, Max S. Gordon's Come Get Your Life, Come Get Your Death, and Adam Serwer's The Tragedy of Eric Killmonger. All of these critique the film for the ways in which it portrays Black Americans, especially Killmonger. And they offer compelling critical readings. But my gut reaction when I read these was that maybe these are just American writers a little uncomfortable with the fact that their version of Blackness was not foregrounded in the film. So that was the gut reaction, and I had to think more about that. So on a personal note, I'm a Black Guyanese, so I'm from Guyana in South America. And one of the things that I really loved about the movie was its representation of diversity within Blackness. All of those people groups, languages, occupations, or at least hints at them. And Wakanda was a very, to me, diverse place. And I actually found something salutary in the way that the film refused to define Blackness in exclusively American terms. To me, that arrangement was a reminder that African Americans are part of something larger, and that they do not have exclusive purchase on what it means to be Black. So while I do have some reservations informed by those readings about the film's treatment of Black Americans, I still applaud the writer and director for emphasizing diasporic identity. But I got to wondering about the currents of frustration and disappointment that ran through those three pieces. And so this essay is my effort to kind of wrestle with that disappointment. So I want to offer 3 theses about Black Panther, and that's the title of my paper today. Keep in mind that these are theses, right? Arguments that invite rebuttal and revision. So my first argument is this: Wakandans are not Black, at least not at first. Their collective self-definition is tethered to conceptions of nation, tribal alliance, and geography. And while Nakia and Wakabi exhibit impulses to reach beyond the borders, even their sense of obligation to the world beyond Wakanda is based on a sense of moral obligation or noblesse oblige that comes with privilege. They want to help suffering people, but not necessarily or not only because they believe that those people are like them. So neither character articulates what we might term a racial awareness that emphasizes kinship with other Africans or people of African descent. So if Blackness is diasporic consciousness, if it is forged and forced into existence by long histories of violence and resistance and renegotiation, then Wakandans who have sequestered themselves from that history in the interest of preserving their way of life are effectively cut off from Blackness. They haven't experienced the history, they do not see themselves, and we cannot quite see them as part of the diaspora. I want to get more into why, but first a reminder. So in inviting us to imagine what Black people could have been without European colonization, Black Panther conjures up vivid and compelling possibilities of political stability, unbroken ties to tradition, rapid technological advancement, even gender equality. So if you consider that war in Wakanda is largely stylized, and here again, I'm talking only about the film, it's largely a stylized ritual, and the greatest warriors of the land are women. Cultural diversity is visible, it seems to be celebrated, commerce is booming, tech innovation seemingly inevitable, and it's apparently driven not by necessity, but by the imagination and ingenuity of a millennial, or really a Generation Z young woman. So the supply of vibranium is endless, and ecology and technology seems to have achieved some kind of synergy there, like they don't have ecological problems in Wakanda. So no one seems to be suffering. The nation's heavily fortified borders are virtually impervious. So no wonder then that Wakandans resist efforts to extend the community of empathy and kinship beyond the force field of their border. All of this is possible because Wakandans have avoided the very history that's constructed diasporic Blackness, at least as many of us understand it here in the US today. So this brings me to my second thesis, that ironically, this fantasy of an alternative past, the same one that's drawn so many Black people in particular, Black audience members to Black Panther, and kept so many of us coming back to the film, that fantasy is a fantasy about the erasure, or maybe the ingenious evasion, of the very history that produced Blackness as we understand it, particularly in the United States. So I want to suggest that this is at the root of what made some early critics of the film really uncomfortable. The critiques offered by Gordon and Lebron and Serwer arise in part from this problem, and each author recognizes and wrestles with the way that the movie simultaneously celebrates and resists being Black. So thesis 1, that Wakandans are not Black, and thesis 2, much of what draws so many people to the film is a fantasy about the erasure of the history that has produced Blackness. My third claim, rooted in the first two, is that Eric Killmonger Stevens is the only Black character in the film. His is the historically aware and historically burdened diasporic consciousness that assumes a necessary allegiance between Wakandans and what he calls the 2 billion other people who look like them. Killmonger understands Blackness in terms of shared suffering, mutual obligation, and his understanding of Blackness has far more in common with the conceptions of Blackness that American audiences in particular might recognize. He sees kinship through shared history that has become racialized. So he expects help from Wakandans, even though they haven't shared that same history. He sees superficial is the wrong word here, but he sees a resemblance on the surface. And importantly, he sees family ties. And he thinks that those things bring with it responsibility. Wakandans should be interested and invested in other Black people just because those people are Black. So this historical consciousness, this awareness of the imagined community of a Black diaspora, is what Wakanda needs from him in order to expand its ethical vision. And it's why Black audiences, especially American audiences, need Killmonger to help us lay claim to Wakanda. Because Wakandans cannot be Black without someone to articulate the claim that they are part of a larger community. And Killmonger, in his monstrosity and tragedy, both asserts the claims of Blackness on Wakanda and embodies the need for the fantasy world to confront the results of this history of violence and injustice. So if Wakanda is a fortress, right, that defends against history, Killmonger breaks in on the fortress to assert his claim, to assert Black people's claim to kinship. All of this is why I wanted so desperately for Killmonger to be redeemed and recognized as Wakandan by the end of the film. To me, embracing, recognizing, healing Killmonger would make Wakanda Black. At the very least, I hope that the film would hold out that possibility with some sort of ambiguous ending. Instead, and here I have to agree with Christopher Lebron's analysis, Black Panther falls short because it cloaks Killmonger in familiar and dangerous cliches about what Lebron calls Black American gangsterism. In some significant ways, the film succumbs to the stereotypes. And Killmonger's tragedy, his traumatic loss of his family, his sense of moral obligation to a larger community, all of that morphs into this violent, short-sighted egotism and hypermasculine, megalomaniacal aggression. So as Adam Serwer notes, Killmonger, quote, cannot see beyond his own rage. His vision of the world starting over begins with an apocalyptic bloodbath. He wants vengeance on all colonizers, all their allies, all their children. And sadly, all notions of Blackness as community or history or creative energy, all of that is absorbed into the void of his own ego and his own personal pain. So of course he has to be stopped. And of course he has to die. And of course, the film's creators endeavor to compensate for that loss by offering a way out of the dilemma that they have created. And the way out is T'Challa, whose encounter with his doomed cousin compels him to reconceive that relationship to Black people. So Killmonger is the catalyst for the emergence of T'Challa's Black consciousness, even if, as Adam Serwer has argued, T'Challa's initial conception of his relationship to Black Americans carries some neo-colonial undertones. So Black Panther and Wakanda constitute a fantasy about suppressed possibilities for societies and cultures on the African continent. And for many viewers, that's an important part of the film's appeal. But as I've argued, that fantasy about other possible histories and futures is not a vision of Blackness, at least not fully. And yet, I still see much to celebrate in this movie. Some of what I celebrate has nothing to do with the narrative, just the visuals, the depictions of dark skin inhabited proudly, without stigma or self-consciousness or anxiety. All of those things strike a chord. All of those things meet a need. However, I'm also willing to celebrate the film's dramatization of the emergence, flawed, incomplete emergence, of a more inclusive, more nuanced vision of Blackness, Killmonger's vision without the violence. That vision, which brings the creative energy and imaginative possibility of Afrofuturism together with a historical awareness and a sense of kinship with a larger community, that vision offers a compelling image of Black possibility for the 21st century. If only Killmonger could have seen it. Thank you.
Would you mind if I go next? Because what I wanted to say actually follows really nicely on what.
Sure.
Okay. I was supposed to be third, so I'm asking to go next. Some of you know me. My name is Katrinka Sandal-Sands. I'm an associate professor in political science. I'm a political geographer. And what I study actually is what's called popular geopolitics. So it's how our media actually teaches us, shows us how politics work, how we fit into the world. How do we know about the Middle East from the media that we watch? Because most of us have never been there. So the only way that we know about places is by how we see them. And so that's what I do for my research. Now, when I read that the Marvel Studios president actually described Black Panther as a big geopolitical action, action adventure, I was like, I am on board. Get me my ticket now. But the question then is, well, what kind of geopolitical adventure is this supposed to be? Particularly if, despite having action sequences in Busan, most of it is actually happening inside of a single country. And how is that then geopolitical? What does this mean about the rest of the world? Now, because of the kind of work that I do with the Marvel Cinematic Universe itself, when I go to one of these movies, I want to immediately situate it within this wider universe of what does Marvel think about the world. And how Marvel thinks about the world is through a lens of political liberalism. Now, just so you know, I don't mean Bernie Sanders. I'm not talking about liberals. This is political liberalism, which is a political ideology about how does the world work and how do societies work together. Within international relations, there's two sort of major theories. There's liberalism and there's realism. And within the comic book world, there's a very nice division between Marvel being liberalist and DC being realist. And in fact, in my politics on film class, I sort of take a poll, straw poll that first day, and I can pretty much peg people's political ideologies by whether you're a Cap fan or a Batman fan. Like, it kind of falls. But what do I mean by Marvel is liberalist? Because what is liberalism? For those of you who have not taken my class, liberalism is the political ideology that we're probably most familiar with, because most of our domestic policies are based within liberalism. And so it's things like the idea that all citizens are equal before the law. That is the political liberalism. There's a sense that power is derived from the people and given to the government. And so this is that idea of the social contract that is necessary between a population and their governed. But within liberalism, there's also the economic side. And so this idea of that is what liberty is. Liberalism, liberty. That liberty is of the individual is defined as the ability of an individual to own property and to own private property and to own the fruits of their own labor. And so that's individual economics within liberalism. And then you also have this idea that the proper economic system is one based on the free market and capitalism, and that government shouldn't interfere in the movement of capital, of money. And that's international global capitalism. Now, I'm hoping all of you are going, yeah, okay, I know that, because this is really what we are taught is how governments are supposed to work. This is the underlying basis of Marvel's cinematic universe. Now, how this works at the international level, geopolitics, is that liberalism treats states as if they were individuals. And so states have rights and responsibilities. That there's a social contract amongst states for the betterment of all. This idea that we're in it together. And so that there are social norms and responsibilities that are to be adhered to. That you have alliances that last beyond just whatever is the most immediate threat. Okay? Now, realism is different, in that realism is how we generally think about international relations. We actually have this nice little split in our heads. We're liberals in the domestic world and we're realists in the international world. In that the realists put the state first. And their idea is that the world is anarchy. There's no one above to control the states. Therefore, just think about like a playground where the teacher's gone to the bathroom. It goes Lord of the Flies really fast. That's the realist view of the world. And so it's about state power, state interests, that the way that you control your own protection is either to be the biggest, baddest bully on the block, to align yourself with the biggest, baddest bully on the block, even though everybody knows that you're going to jump ship as soon as it's not in your interest, a la Batman. Or you're the kid that's sitting in the corner reading a book that nobody even notices is there, and so then you're totally fine because nobody even cares about you. Okay? Those are the ways that you keep yourself safe as a realist. Now, think about that writ large in terms of a country. How do you do that? You either have the biggest guns, you have the strongest allies, or you're Wakanda, hiding behind a force field so nobody knows you're there. So, one of the things that I found most interesting as a political geographer watching this movie was I realized that for the very first time, I saw everybody in this movie was realists. In almost all of the other MCU movies, you have Captain America fighting the fascists. You have, I'm blanking.
Iron Man.
Iron Man.
Well, Iron Man also fights realists. The Robert Redford character in
That's Captain America, Winter Soldier.
Winter Soldier, he's a realist. When Nick Fury is trying to build the biggest boats, and Cap is very, very, very uncomfortable about that, what he's doing is actually expressing, Nick Fury is showing realist values of that we need the biggest guns out there so that we can stop an international, i.e. from aliens, attack, rogue nation attack, and the liberal Captain America is uncomfortable with it. And the realist is defeated in every single case. But here I was watching Black Panther, and the two sort of aspects of realism, this offensive realism of where you take the fight to the other. The idea of, offense is, your best defense is a good offense, is what Killmonger was expressing. He was very clearly a realist. He was, the only way to be powerful is to have the strongest guns. The only way to subvert the current system is to take the guns and overthrow and become the biggest, baddest bully on the block. And he certainly was, as you could see with all of his kill nicks. He was demonstrating that. He was embodying that. But what about T'Challa? He's our hero. How could he also be realist? But he was the other kind of realist. He was that defensive realist. He was the realist who actually wanted to hide behind his wall. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the hashtag, but Wakanda is alt-right. And that shocked me when I really started looking into it and thinking about that. because it was about Wakandans first. It was about hiding behind one's borders and the idea that you could build a wall, build a force field that would protect you and your technology, and that everything in your world would be hunky-dory perfect if you could just stay behind your wall. Now, when you think about that, with this movie coming out in January of 2018 into the national context of Black Lives Matter, coming into the national/international context of the Trump presidency, coming into the truly global context of a resurgence of populism and nativism, really nativism in the world, and the political desires to hide from the world behind one's own walls of one's own nationalism and nativism. It was fascinating to me that you had Wakanda in essence being a bastion of this works. But the thing is, it didn't. Because the whole point, and why, of course, this is a part of the Marvel universe, is that T'Challa had to move beyond his nativism. He had to move beyond the wall. He had to realize that that wall was actually holding himself and his people back. And he started to get the realization of how that would work in his relationship with Nakia, and her recognition of that there's a wider world out there. And his care for her made her ideas resonate with him, so that he actually started to question his tradition that he had gotten from his father and his father and his father and his father. But that nativism that he was battling was so strong, it made his father kill his own brother to protect it. 2 minutes? And so the scene when he goes back to the ancestor land and actually is like, "You're wrong," was the moment when T'Challa became a liberal. Again, I don't mean Bernie Sanders. I mean that he began to recognize the importance of interconnection. He began to recognize how much pain is caused to others through self-isolation. And it was through his relationship with Nakia and his relationship with Killmonger that this was possible. And so just like Tony Stark had his arc from war profiteer, hardcore gun guy, to world savior, I will give up my world, my life, my baby to save the universe, T'Challa is now already on that same path. I'll stop there.
Walter Grayson.
Thank you, sir. It's a great honor to be here with all of you today, and I'm going to try to do this very quickly, but there's going to be a lot of content in the next couple minutes, both speaking to some of the pieces that my previous presenters have offered. But I'm really honored that you guys asked me, because you know me well. You know I do this stuff for a long time. So to start, I came here with the intention of talking about the way that I teach the Black Panther content, the way that over a period of almost 20 years, I've repeatedly come back to these stories to give students a way to approach their world, and it's evolved, and it's become helpful. We were working on these issues up at Brown University about a month ago. By the end of the month, we're going to be continuing the project at Columbia, and so bringing it to Rowan is a tremendous opportunity, and I'm so grateful. To start, I have to say a couple things about how I got started in all this. I didn't like the Black Panther comics when Stan and Jack had started it, and when Don McGregor was writing it as Jungle Action. I had seen them. I had pretty much cast them aside. They were essentially ways of taking Tarzan mythos and converting them into a story about Pan-Africanism and the possibility of an inclusive future. I really came on board in the very end of the 90s, early 2000s, when a guy named Christopher Priest was writing. And he did something that I criticized almost from the first day I saw the issue. He took blaxploitation film tropes from the 1970s, particularly Shaft, and brought those in as a kind of visual context for the Black Panther story. So he essentially made the title character T'Challa into a private eye, which itself was a corruption of the Black Panther Party kinds of images that had emerged in the 70s. So I engaged these very critically from early on to say, okay, what are you actually doing with what you're offering as art here? The Dora Milaje were essentially portrayed as teenage prostitutes in the first 2 years of the comics, except they were bodyguards and they would use kung fu and weapons to defeat gangsters. Very troublesome kinds of ways and tropes that are still evolving really out of hip-hop through the 80s and 90s that Priest tapped into to sell more comics and did it very effectively. Did it for over 5 years in a run that had never been done before with the character. In the course of that run, one of the points where I criticized him was about the way I decided to start teaching the book, teach the content. And that was in 2003, when he and I started talking publicly about how to manage this story and manage this character. And so from that point forward, I was always looking at Priest and his personal traumas and how he played those out through the stories that he wrote, which happened in 2-issue cycles, 3-issue cycles. And he was really receptive. That relationship set me on a path where the actual Marvel Comics editorial team named me an ambassador to Wakanda. There's a public acknowledgement to say I'm to go out and engage this conversation with scholars, with the public. So this has been a long-standing mission for me. From there, it evolved into a social media context when the next writer took over, who was Reginald Hudlin. Hudlin took over in 2006, and when he crafted the story, it was explicitly about taking African-American images from hip-hop and making this a Pan-African story. More than anything, Hudlin wanted us to engage the questions that you guys are raising today. And in the course of 4 years of almost daily online conversation, the place that you mentioned where T'Challa has his conversion experience, this is called the Jalia, D-J-A-L-I-A. The Jalia is a West African spiritual place where ancestors commune with those who hold the responsibility of governance. I literally wrote that in 2007 and demanded that the writers begin to incorporate it into the stories. So the fact of the Jalia becoming a part of this blockbuster film, I nearly wept in the theater the first time I saw it, that they had taken the time to actually build in this aspect and make it begin to happen. So from there, that transition from 2007 to 2018, there are a body of us now, probably 200, 250 of us across the country who now do Afrofuturist media studies and artistic creation. We hold conferences all over the world. We built the kind of awareness of what came out of the movie for the global audience that manifested in how the story unfolded. So in 2016, the symbol that I contributed to this was called the Wakanda Syllabus. And the Wakanda Syllabus took both works of art, digital media, previous short films and cartoons, other novels that had been written, and compiled them all in one source that said, if you want to understand what's happening in this film that's about to come out, here's where you start. Read these 30, 40, 50, at least a couple of these sources so you can understand it better. And it did well. The syllabus drew maybe 2 million people in 2 years that got to read it and start to think about and then respond. For the scholars on the panel, I do want to mention, out of that spun in 2018, the same publisher, the African American Intellectual History Society, published a series on these questions. And so like Wakanda and the Cold War, for instance. Those are all available. I just did the hashtag. It's AAIHS, and you put in Black Panther, and all the essays come up. My particular response was published by the Tropics of Maida, and this was about this key piece of the Jalia and why it's important to deal with African spirituality. But all of that frames for you guys today, as I check my clock. Yep, not too bad off time. The failure of racial integration in the United States. The fact that we came into the last 50 years and never grappled with the idea that those who advocated for continuing segregation really prevailed. This is the core of what Ryan Coogler brings to the film. It's what shaped Christopher Priest's writing about the character. It's what shaped what Hudlin was attempting to do to make this Pan-African comic. It's what I try to kind of bring to the table with stuff like the Wakanda syllabus. Now, this is what we talked about at Brown. Racial integration, we had this idea that it was a good. At least desegregation should occur, and we should have people of all ethnic and racial and religious backgrounds, no matter linguistic and religious diversity, come together. Our room is an example of that. This room would have been illegal in a lot of places 50 years ago. And so we have to appreciate that kind of victory. At the same time, without defining a clear standard of what we expect racial integration to be, we have wildly different ideas about what makes an inclusive community. So in the segregation studies of major cities and neighborhoods that I use as an urbanist, most white people who live in areas say that if an area has 3% non-white people, it's integrated. That's sufficient. On the other hand, most people who are Black or Latinx tend to feel like it's got to be at least 12%. Some places they'll say 15 non-white for it to be integrated. No common standard. No one agrees on this to this day. We're publishing new research just on what do people think integration should be? What is an inclusive community in 2020? A little late. And so in that void, as you see the actual film come out, it's really about how can integration happen? And I'm going to walk through one very specific example of this. I do this based on the book that we put out in conjunction with the film last February. It's called Cities Imagined. It's essentially a history of Black architecture and the places that made the civil rights movement possible. But in the last chapter, we compare Gotham City and Wakanda and talk about these places of how do we imagine where do we live and what does it mean to become inclusive. So the story I want you to focus on is Everett K. Ross. This is the CIA agent who jumps in front of Nakia when Killmonger attempts to break out Claw from the jail in Korea. That act is compressing about 4 years of storytelling where Ross in the comic learns to abandon the American government and turn his back and say, I will support Wakanda. Wakanda has this vision for a better world. That process has a lot of complicated ins and outs, but I'll say at the end of the film, in the second end credit scene, right after they finished all the other testimony about who produced the film, Ross sits in the audience at the United Nations as T'Challa says, or is about to respond to the question, what does a nation of farmers have to teach us? Huge line for them to close on and has tremendous portent for the sequel, which is where I'm going to wrap up as a little sneak preview of where Black Panther 2 is going to go. That piece where Ross abandons the CIA, and I think LeBron completely misreads this in his article as the CIA kind of becoming the white savior in the story. This is a conversion, much like what happens to Bucky Barnes in being rehabilitated coming out of Winter Soldier. And Winter Soldier is another piece of context here. It's showing colonizers, to use Nakia's term, or not Nakia, Shuri's term, how to actually become full human beings by embracing Pan-Africanism. How do you actually arrive at a new destination and create a better world? I think some of this has to come back to Njobu confronting his blackness in the opening scene and telling the story to Eric as a small child. I think we don't appreciate enough the fact that T'Challa as the Black Panther was a war dog and was engaged in the world. And Marvel has a multiple level engagement with Nigeria as a non-Wakandan African state that I think we need to interrogate. But most of all, with Shuri and T'Challa at the end, there's this closing in Oakland. And Oakland, as the foundation of the actual Black Panther Party, as the hometown for Ryan Coogler, is this site to say, if we can go there and learn from them, if we can embrace what that community does to create an inclusive community, to make a better society for all people, then we can actually begin to, in my view, actually restore the Wakandas that have historically existed. Wakanda is not just a fictional metaphor that we're like, oh, one day there's an advanced African civilization. There have been thousands of places built by people of African descent that are extraordinarily advanced and have been lost through very intentional colonial and segregationist policy. And so in reclaiming that and rebuilding that, I think we can situate our conversation a little better and see what the path that Everett Cray Ross is on, how we avoid replicating the kinds of problems that Claw was really designed to represent. Claw overall is a colonialist, and so we can leave that behind. But that whole process, to me, is what I'm here to do with you guys. My students over the last 2 years have built 6 virtual Wakandas based on actual historic segregated communities of how to invest and bring money and create not just a scientific and information exchange in a low-income neighborhood, but actually fully transform segregated communities throughout the South is one of our bigger projects. The one example you can find for this that we have online is titled Exploring Diaspora Arts. It's a look at how do you connect and restore both Harlem and South Side of Chicago. And that's the work that I do every day. How do we actually take something that looks like a movie? It's fun, it's compelling in some ways, but actually turn it into something better for all of us to live in. And I honestly would say that there's a lot to do here in Glassboro.
Very good. And now we're going to have comments from 2 of our student panelists, both recommended by the coordinator of Africana Studies, Chanel Rose. So we're very excited to hear from both of them. And whichever one of you wishes to go first is fine.
I go. Okay, so I broke my perspectives up into 2 parts, basically. I had an idealistic perspective and then a realist perspective. I think, I followed a little bit of her ideals. So yeah, for the idealistic perspective of the movie in itself, I feel like it did have a cultural impact and representation because it was the first Black superhero to appear in like a Marvel DC universes. And in the movie, it portrays Wakanda as secretly the most technologically advanced country in the world. Also that Wakanda represents a dream of Africa, and I think they touched on this before, uninterrupted by colonialism and European cultural dominance. And I think that the movie did pretty good with the rituals and the language and the African garments and everything of that sort. And then for my realist perspective, I personally feel that it wasn't a true representation of African culture, and it kind of portrayed like a fictional African nation. And because, me personally being Afro-Americans, we have no real central identity because of, slavery and coming over here, the New World. We cling to certain things that give us representation. And so I feel like, like movies like Jordan Peele and movies from Nollywood, for example, they give like really great representation of like Africa or African Americans in the past, present, or in the future, and that we should like see more movies or like directors in that sort of sense, kind of just like portraying Africans, Afro-Americans in, regular settings and activities and, economic disparity, just, everyday life. So that's my perspective on it, I think.
Okay, I'm Nigerian, so the Nollywood is like Nigerian Hollywood, so I grew up in that culture. I grew up watching Nollywood movies. I grew up, seeing a different side of the world and media. So I'm coming from a more African perspective and more like cultural and like what like people who are from Nigeria and Ghana and Kenya and Somalia and what they think of the movie. So I look more into the conflict of it. When I watched the movie, I looked at the deeper conflict between tribes and between not just like the border tribe who came to challenge T'Challa and who do stuff like that. That actually is a real thing in Africa. Like, there's different issues between, not just like, I'm Nigerian, so I can use my culture, like, I'm Yoruba. There's a stigma that Yorubas and Igbos don't get along, and that Yorubas and Hausas don't get along, and issues of that sort. And then there's issues between like Nigerians and Ghanaians don't get along, or Somalians and Ethiopians don't get along, or like the issues between the like revolutions within these African countries. Like, those issues are real, and those issues play a part in why people like Killmonger come into Africa and say, you didn't help me, you didn't show me these things, you didn't show me these issues. That's because there's internal conflict that needs to be fixed before we can come into worlds like the United States and European countries to show them like the inclusiveness within the Black community and within, like, I really loved the way Professor Williams said that, I just lost my train of thought. But the way she talked about how that the African countries, they want, like, I really lost my train of thought. But anyways, in more of a sense that saying that, like, there are all these internal issues they're the reasons why you don't see a lot of, like, connections between the African community and the African American community. Like, there's so many, like, I know there was an issue on Twitter that I seen a few weeks ago that was like, oh, Nigerians, we call African Americans, we call them, what do we call them, Elijah? What do we call them? Akata. That's a Nigerian, a Yoruba term. Akata is what, like,
someone who picks peppers.
Yeah, someone who picks, and like issues like that need to be fixed within the African community. And I think the African community as a whole need to see, like, I love the fact that the African community needs to see that all this internal conflict that we have within us needs to be fixed, because African Americans feel like we're neglecting them the same way we feel like African Americans are neglecting us. How can we as a culture come to like the Wakanda issue, like between like because they kind of had a revolution where the Killmonger was getting other Wakandans against each other because the internal like conflict that should we go out and should we help other countries and show them all the wonderful things we are doing and the technology advancements. How can you fix that when you still have tribes battling each other? How can you come out and help other people when you still have an issue with others? You know what I mean? Like, that's where my sort of like love for Black Panther came from, was that, yeah, the like, as a lot of Africans said, like, yeah, the African acting was bad and the dialect was horrible, but it showed, it's funny because the accents are really bad, but like, it really showed that Africans as a whole need to come together. We need to start like connecting with each other and with our tribes and countries to help other outside worlds. Like, there are so many beautiful places in Africa. Like, I'm in ASA and we're doing the Miss Africa, Mr. Africa pageant, and there's a contestant who's doing Mauritius. I never heard of Mauritius, and I'm African. Oh, wow. And Mauritius, I was doing my research, and Mauritius is beautiful. Like, and islands like Seychelles, like those are beautiful parts of Africa. No one ever gets to see. Why? Because of all these issues and internal conflicts and like sort of the way Dr. Williams said, like, we're very reserved and the way we're like we don't want to look out to help others. Like, things like that are the reason why, like, I kind of love the Black Panther, like, the sort of, like, how at the end of the film, they do come to United Nations and are like, what are you going to teach us? Well, we have all of this that we're going to teach you, and we have all of that that's going on, and we have this technological advancement. Like, look at the way they, like, showed STEM. STEM is a big thing in the African, like, culture. Like, they're engineers and like mechanics and stuff like that. Those are very big in the African culture, and the way they sort of like increased that and showed all the advancements, I thought that was amazing. Like, I really loved that. And I also felt a sort of like, I don't know, the way, remember I'm coming from an African point of view, but the way that they showed that the one white or American character come and save her, like, I just didn't, I don't know, I wanted more cultural representatives. I wanted to see maybe an Indian or maybe like a South American or an Asian do something like that. Because what he was doing isn't something that, it's not something that other cultures can't do. Like, other cultures do come to America, they do conform, they do assimilate, they do learn the culture and love the culture. So I didn't like how they kind of just made the the white, because like we said, America is changing from a melting pot to a tossed salad. So why can't we sort of incorporate that into our movies and our language and stuff like that? So that's basically my perspective.
Okay, and we have over 15 minutes for any questions from the audience. If you don't mind just raising your hand and identifying yourself, please state your name and your relationship, major to Rowan, whatever it might be, here and then there.
I'm Taylor. I have an associate's in fine arts, and now I'm working on a film degree. I wanted to ask just anyone here, especially people, those of you who are African,
Descent?
Descent.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, descent, yes. I remember reading an article about Danai Gurira's character in the film, how Okoye was supposed to say something to one of the other female warriors that would indicate that maybe they have like a relationship, like a loving relationship together, and how it was sort of cut out of the film. And I do understand that within both in Africa, culturally, homosexuality is kind of a taboo. It is with both in Africa and in a lot of Asian countries, like South Asian countries. It is very, there's a lot of stigma towards it, and also here in this country, there's a lot of stigma within different color communities, and I just wanted to know what your thoughts on that scene either being removed or being either wanting it to be like portrayed, or what are your thoughts?
Personally, I think it was good that they removed it, just because, again, homosexuality within not just the African community, but the African American community is still very sensitive topic. Like, a lot of Africans who saw the movie, if they would have seen that, especially like the older ones, the more like old school, they probably would have felt like disrespected, like, don't show this yet. Like, we have not accepted this yet. Let us, like, you know, Africa as a country, and African American, we're still learning about homosexuality, and we're still learning to accept people from different walks of life and who love differently. Like, we're still learning to accept that. So I feel like, I don't know, it might have, like, adding that scene might have deteriorated the whole moral, like, not more, but the main message of the film. Like, that might have, I don't know.
Yeah, just go real quickly on that, and I forgot to pay off my promise about the preview.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
But on your point, I think it's revolutionary just that Coogler and the cast committed to it, just to have it to begin with, and that was more of a Disney decision to kind of make that move about a potential mass audience. But the comics are rife with it. The critical stuff that we've written on it at the Society have been very attentive to it. And so I would say, again, the part two to this is one of the understated and peripheral characters is Ayo, and she is in that relationship, and that will come in part two. So that's one. The previous payoff was T'Challa as a war dog, like Njobu, is basically a nod to the fact in Hudlin's stories that Wakanda has agents out around the world all through the last 2,000 years. And there are key points in history where Wakandans intervene off camera to the main historical narrative to turn societies different ways. And so that's the thing that you're going to see much more pronounced in the sequel. And so it'll complicate some of the analysis that we do.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Noel. I'm a graduate. But one thing I wanted to just express to everyone is that, like, one thing everybody should check out, because I haven't heard anybody anybody, well, put it like this, I'm a big comic book fan. I grew up with comic books since like the age of time. So like for me personally, everybody should really check out, if you really want to understand where the movie of Black Panther and all the imagery, because everything that happened in that movie already happened in the comic book, but was just created by different people. The original Black Panther run that was put on into spin for that movie was made by Ta-Nehisi Coates. He originally written the original like storyline of Black Panther that became so popular, and then two prolific Black writers and poets end up taking over it and creating the book called World of Wakanda. That was Roxane Gay and Tanya Harvey, who are two prolific female, one African and the other African American writers and publishers in the comic book world. And basically the idea of the World of Wakanda was to let people know, to basically give a better representation of what Black Panther was supposed to be about, because from what one of the speakers had said earlier, is that the early forms of Black Panther end up becoming more tribalistic than anything. You know, they weren't really hitting the real points of what Black people saw when they looked at Black Panther, and I think that's one of the greatest things that Stan Lee did. He openly said that when he originally gave Ty Coates the original written run of it. He said, you know, because of, he pretty much put it like this, and I think this is something everybody should learn and hear, is that superheroes aren't really like, they're not supposed to be looked and examined too much, right? Because majority of the heroes were created by white men, and because of that, most of these heroes either have some type of you know, some type of idealizations of those eras in which these heroes were created. For example, you know, Wonder Woman. Everybody loves Wonder Woman, but she walks around with a whip, right? And she walks around with a mini skirt, and you know, and a lot of things of it, if you look at the character of Wonder Woman, all deals back to a fetishization of BDSM, which comes from the original creator of Wonder Woman. So like that in itself is, you know, crazy that Wonder Woman into today can still look the way she does and be a complete negative format for woman empowerment. And I think it's kind of funny how we've taken that image of what it means and actually changed it into something else that isn't real. And that's what I want to go into with the Black Panther. I think it represents something that's like amazing for people to look at, but the real truth of Wakanda has nothing to do about Black people in general. It has to do with the idealization of moving the entire human population forward into a utopia. Yes, Wakanda was the most technological savvy country, but if you read the original comic runs, so was the entire country. Then half of the country bombed themselves to hell, and then Wakanda separated themselves from the entire world. So in that sense, the reason why Black T'Challa's father didn't want to open the world up to everybody else wasn't the fact of how evil the world was. It really had to do with the importance of what they celebrated as their idealization. So for them, it was keeping everything safe, and for T'Challa and his family was to keep everything safe. But when you look at Killmonger, it wasn't about that, because he didn't grow up with those same cultural stances. So I think like the entire movie within itself was like a good premise for people to look at and people to observe. But I think what people should really take out of it, if you read the book World of Wakanda, written by Roxane Gay and Tonya Harvey, you'll look at it and see that it was more about moving the world forward. If you read any, it was really based off of, and Roxane Gay said this because she actually won an award for the book when the movie started getting awards. And she really said like, she loved the importance of how people were looking at it, but it was more deeper in the sense of humanity and how we had to move forward. So, and she said that the idealization of the world of Wakanda was based on philosophers like Plato, like Socrates, like Aristotle, about how humanity could work. But in this case, it was around African people. But this could be applied to any other country if you look at it historically, right? Because every other country has had successful civilizations that have been destroyed. The only difference between Wakanda was that they kept themselves away from all the problems. So ideally, the movie is a great representation for Black people, but I feel as though it could have done better in the sense of like, how, like, you know, the accuracies of black plight, what's going on in America. Like, it's a good example. If you watch any movie that involves black plight, you're gonna see the exact same formats. I feel like they didn't get into the essence of what Wakanda is. They just took all, like, okay, Black Panther, you know, they just took all the struggle between African Americans and Africans and put it on the screen. And I think that's like, it's good and it's negative at the same time, because, like I said, the reason why there's such these negative connotations between Africans and African Americans is directly due to colonization and, you know, the implications of living in a society that doesn't benefit your skin color. So I feel like it should have took more of what the book was about and moved it forward in a sense of a utopia. And I think Killmonger actually said it best. He said, why have just one Wakanda? We can have the whole world of Wakanda. And I think a lot of people didn't look at that and see what he was talking about. They weren't just saying about black people, they were talking about universally moving the entire society forward. So I just want to ask, like, people above and board, like, do you guys think, like, in the sense of the movie, do you think it gave a true representation of what it means to move forward as a society, or did it give a better representation of what it means for black people in Africa to move forward as a society? And reading from, like, the direction of, because I don't know if you guys ever read the book, but the book is a real basis to this movie. And I think that's one of the most important parts, because everybody took this movie and didn't read the original book of how this was created and don't understand. Because when I tell people Todd Coates written Black Panther in 2016, they're like, what? I never even known that. And I'm like, exactly the point. Like, you don't know that there's so much premises in this movie. Even if you look at it, when he did the run, he started introducing gods into, you know, African gods, African spirituality, and all of those things into the actual premise. And what the movie did was kind of, it touched it, but it didn't really touch it. It just made a movie for people to be like, oh, that's cool to look at. And then they didn't really, like, explain it. Like I'm saying, like, it's just, to me, do you guys think did it give a good representation? Because if you look at it, it looks good and nice, but if you talk to anybody that's read the original comic and is African like me, I'm South African, I don't think it was a good thing all in total. I think it just basically gave black people in America something to look at and be awed and be like, oh, it's doing so much, but in reality, it didn't really go into depth of the true problems of the world of Wakanda. And I think that's pretty much what I had to say.
All right, brief reaction time for comment here.
I would say yes, in that you just, in many ways, restated my thesis in your own words. In that, one of the things about this idea of taking Wakanda and making the world Wakanda is that is what liberalism is trying to do. It's really about human progress. That is the whole point of liberalism, particularly in the international realm, is making us all better through working together. And that is what Wakanda could be in its utopian sense for us all. And that is something that I think that's one of the major messages of why they stepped beyond the border at the end. Yeah.
From a different angle, I think something to think about is just how much of an investment we have in this representation, right? Because one part of what you said just now was that they just gave us something kind of spectacular to look at and then we could walk away from it. But you're hearing on the panel just how many levels of resonance even the something to look at has given us. So I think we can't place so much weight on the film that it needs to, like, speak all of the truths about history, about politics, about the origin story. For me, what's great about stories, right, is that we keep doing that kind of rereading. It makes me think this, it makes me think that. So it couldn't, in 2.5 hours or 2 hours, right, it couldn't speak to this whole range of issues, but look at all the different ways that we keep rereading it. And I think that's of value, right? I think the ways that it falls short, that you're feeling that it falls short, is actually a sign of the possibilities that it opens up, right? It falls short, and then we come and we fill in all the things that the film, anyway, hasn't quite given us.
Do you guys think that even if it failed? Because to me, I definitely do agree with that. But you could have took that you could have took that same exact story and created not as a comic book, but for something for black children and everybody. Like, for example, what Nigerian was saying, something like what Jordan Peele did. Like, Jordan Peele is creating classics now, like black classics, something that generationally all our children can watch. And I feel like that's the point that they were trying to do with that movie. But at the same time, you could have made that entire movie without it having to be a superhero premise, because once again, there's a thin line between what's a comic book and what's a real actual reality. And I think that's the point that I kind of want to, that's the point I feel shortcoming of, because once again, like I said, I could basically take a Superman book and say, this is true and this is real and Superman's my God, but realistically it's just a book. The same thing with the world of Wakanda, and that was one of the things that Roxane Gay tried to point out in that book, that there is a thin line between what is real right here and what is not real, and that's what I felt like they didn't take from the original origin story. Not saying that it wasn't a good representation, but they didn't take the essence of what they were trying to put in that comic into a movie film.
So maybe that's the work of other artists, right? To pick up on the themes, to pick up on the ideas, to work out from what Roxane Gay and her co-writer have put together, right? Like all the things that you need from the film, right? Those are all things that you need, that you're expressing as needs. That those are things that other artists can go to work on in terms of representing Africa, African Americans, and the relationships between them.
I can't imagine a deeper and more interesting question to end on. So that was a real interesting exchange there. We're out of time, unfortunately, but I believe the panelists will be here up here at the front. So if you didn't have time to get to your question, please come up and ask them. A round of applause for our panelists.